When two experienced cave divers take on a dangerous mission to map an unexplored cave, they are stunned when faced with a series of close calls that lead to a catastrophic event. This is the fatal breakdown of the Santa Rosa Blue Hole tragedy. The desire to explore unknown cave passages is hard to understand if you aren't a cave diver. It takes many years and hundreds of hours to become certified and experienced enough to consider exploring unknown cave tunnels. This work has cost the lives of dozens of divers who thought they had prepared for every possibility. Santa Rosa Blue Hole in New Mexico is an incredibly beautiful diving hole for recreational swimmers and dive training. Its clear depths extend down 80 feet of spring-fed sinkhole, which makes it a perfect training spot for scuba. But only a select few have seen the mysteries of what lies beneath the rock-covered floor of the hole. For 40 years, the entrance to the labyrinth of caves below has been locked away with a metal grate to prevent curious divers from entering. In 1976, 2 divers died in the tight cave tunnels, and it took weeks of searching to find their bodies. The police at the time were able to make some general maps of the tunnels that they had searched, as well as the many tight, unsearchable areas. After the exhaustive search and recovery, the Blue Hole caves were permanently closed to divers. The Army Corps of Engineers dumped rocks into the entrance and covered it with a metal grate to end the risk to further lives in the caves. Over the next decades, the tunnels were largely ignored and forgotten, until in 2013, the ADM Exploration Foundation requested that the grate be removed for experts to enter the caves and map the system. It was thought that this blue hole may be an excellent cave diving location if they could evaluate the passages below. It took several years of work to just excavate the rocks and debris filling the opening before any real explorations could be performed. In 2016, the group had a 10-person dive team ready for a 3-day mission to map the cave's chambers and passable tunnels. Mike Young and Shane Thompson were 2 veteran cave divers who could perform just this type of work. They had decades of cave diving experience and were some of the most advanced cave divers around. On March 26, 2016, Mike and Shane were ready for their last day of diving at the Santa Rosa Blue Hole. Over the past few days, they had made several dives to locate passages, but it didn't really come together as expected. This cave system was more like a pile of boulders and small rocks, with a few narrow channels carved out at the top. A column of boulders the size of cars was piled 120 feet deep, and there was no safe pathway through it. It was a bit of a disappointment that this cave would not be suitable for recreational divers, but Mike was still glad to have checked it thoroughly to see if any passages might be salvageable. The plan for the day was to go down through a tight restriction at 140 feet, and then down to a second restriction at 165 feet. Shane would not be going through the second restriction, but just waiting for Mike in the open area. Shane wore his GoPro camera to record this final trip down in the rocky maze of the Blue Hole. There were 5 more tight restrictions between the 165-foot squeeze and the terminal location mapped in the cave. Mike was taking one last look for any possible passages and retrieving his reel to conclude the expedition. Mike followed the line he had placed over the past few days and carefully maneuvered through each squeeze with his side mount tanks. He had a rebreather-type air tank, which was attached under his arms along his side as he twisted and pulled his way through the strange maze of boulders around him. A rebreather system retains the exhaled air, which still contains most of the oxygen inhaled. The system scrubs the carbon dioxide from the air and makes it safe to be rebreathed. This closed system allows divers to stay down for a much longer time than simple open-system air tanks. Mike had been beyond the 165-foot depth on the previous day's dive and knew that it was nothing but restriction after restriction, with not much to see. Shane was behind Mike as they approached the restriction. Mike held up his hand to indicate wait here. Then he turned and squeezed through the small hole. As soon as his fins disappeared in the silty distance, Shane decided to follow him. This was not in the plan. Mike would have no idea, but Shane impulsively decided to check it out himself. The guidelines snaked along the jagged path, up over some huge car-sized boulders, then down with sharp turns between small piles of rocks through a narrow 3-foot hole. The water was becoming quite silted, but Shane only had to follow the line in his hand to reach the end. Shane saw another restriction ahead, and it gave him a moment of pause. It looked small. He turned his body to the side a little and pulled along the rocks on the sides. His back-mounted rebreather was getting caught on a rock hanging down from the top of the tunnel. He had one arm reaching ahead, while the other was down by his side touching the wall. He twisted and turned, trying to find the right orientation that would clear the obstruction, when he found himself wedged against the wall of the tunnel. He gently pulled and tried to turn one way, and then the other. Nothing happened. He pushed against the rocks to try to go backwards, but his equipment was hitting against rocks behind him. He was aware that any damage to the rebreather could be catastrophic, so he didn't want to push things too far. He pulled and pushed, and then found his breaths becoming faster and more shallow. Shane had decades of experience, but getting stuck triggers a limbic lizard brain response, the survival instinct. He was starting to move more frantically and a bit more careless with his equipment. Suddenly, Mike's arm ran right into his head, and they were face to face in this tight squeeze. Shane was wide-eyed, and then slightly relieved that he wasn't alone 195 feet under the surface. He told Mike that he was stuck and needed help. Mike tried some of the same maneuvers to get him out, but after a few minutes of pushing and pulling, the men were nervous. Shane couldn't move, and Mike couldn't get out if Shane wasn't freed. Finally, Mike helped Shane twist in one direction to free his rebreather, then pulled with everything he had while Shane pushed with his trapped hand. In a burst of movement, he was through the tunnel and pulled into the small terminal room with Mike. The room was only a few feet wide, just enough to turn around. Shane was starting to calm back down, but he was rattled. Mike was clearly confused as to why he was even in that area of the cave, and Shane knew that he had made a mistake. He was wearing a back-mounted rebreather, while Mike had a side mount. This slight difference gave Mike a little more control in positioning himself with his equipment through these tight spaces. Mike indicated that Shane should go first and head back out through the restriction where he had just been stuck. This time, he was able to rake his body along without getting trapped. Mike left the inner room and made his own way through the tough passage before feeling the absolute worst feeling for a cave diver in a silted cave. Shane had yanked the guideline so hard it popped out of Mike's hands and he was completely blind in the unfamiliar maze of rocks at the bottom of Blue Hole. Mike frantically felt around for the line but found nothing. He was in trouble. Shane had followed the guideline out through the next twists and turns in the path, then had to squeeze through another restriction. He entered in easily enough, but the panic of being stuck just minutes before was fresh on his mind. He pulled himself briskly through and the guideline was wrapped up with his legs, jerking it forward in a quick, unexpected moment. Shane freed himself from the tangle, but lost the line in the process. His heart rate shot up and breathing started to quicken again. In a rebreather, this can be particularly dangerous. Fast breaths can cause a buildup of carbon dioxide in the mask, which can be fatal if not cleared by the CO2 scrubber in the system. Controlled breathing is the essential skill in using a rebreather. Shane was well aware of that fact and tried to slow himself down to regain control. He was feeling panicky, and for good reason. He felt around the rocks, trying to locate the line, but only found a series of holes, too small for any diver to pass. It was as if he was trapped in a coffin with random holes punched here and there. He could see out, and even reach an arm through to feel around for the line, but he could not escape. He was hyperventilating and knew it was a dangerous condition, but he couldn't seem to stop. He was desperately plunging his arm through the holes, feeling for the line, when he was startled by what he felt next. It was Mike. He was frantic and grabbed Mike with a death grip so tight that Mike was alarmed. Mike looked in through the hole, and Shane was flailing around in a panic. He moved around the rocks to find an opening to the area where Shane was trapped. All of the holes were too small to fit through, but Shane somehow made it into the area just a few minutes before. Mike dropped down to the bottom and found a way in. He grabbed Shane by the shoulder and turned him around. Shane suddenly thrust himself towards Mike and swam under his body to get out of this trap. As soon as he started to pass Mike in the tunnel, he knew he'd made another mistake. This passage narrowed down, and he was pressed against his friend's body with no way to move forward. He thrashed and kicked. In a full life-and-death struggle, Shane had lost all sense of calm. He ripped his suit and scraped his body against the rocks below him. He jerked free and kicked with all his might. The line was right in front of him, and he was desperate to get out of the rock maze and maybe survive this cluster of bad decisions. He moved swiftly along, too fast for safety, but his experience and knowledge of cave diving was out the window now. He just wanted to escape. His breathing was too fast and his rebreather wasn't keeping up. He grabbed his bailout bottle and started breathing compressed air directly from his emergency backup. This method let the exhaled air just float up to the surface, and it didn't matter how fast he took the air in, the carbon dioxide would just float away. He faced the next tight restriction, slammed his body through and pulled the rocks ahead of him with all his strength. This was a catastrophic mistake. He was stuck. For the third time during this dive, he had wedged himself in a cramped space, not made for a diver and tank to move through. His body was being pressed in every direction, and Shane didn't know what to do. He thrashed and pulled in the cloudy water, with no knowledge of where exactly he was, and whether Mike would ever find him. When Mike was moving through the second squeeze, the guideline was pulled so hard he lost grip, and it disappeared in the silt. He started feeling around the rocks in his immediate vicinity, but found nothing. There were small spaces between rocks where the rope could slip through, and it looked like that's what he would be facing. He didn't want to move forward too much without finding that line. There were spots that had no exit, and squeezes that could trick you when it looked like the path, but wasn't. You might find yourself squeezing into a spot with no way to turn around and no exit hole. Frankly, Mike was starting to panic a little. He knew the danger of moving in the wrong direction and reminded himself to calmly make the next move. Mike swam up and felt around for openings that he might try. He was able to move through an opening above the path and was overwhelmed with a flood of relief when the line suddenly appeared in his path. He grabbed it and followed it through the next restriction ahead. He gripped the rock above to pull himself up when a hand thrusts out from a hole and grips him so tightly he was startled and briefly confused. He looked inside to see a frantic Shane who was completely panicked and trapped away from the line. No matter what level of experience you have, anyone is susceptible to the body's instinctual fight for survival. Neurotransmitters, hormones, and stress molecules flood your system, and the brain is bathed in a mixture of signals for fight or flight. The sensible analysis of a situation is suspended, while the realization of where you are sets in. Escape becomes the sole focus. Mike was well aware of where Shane might be mentally, but he wasn't ready for what came next. Mike found the opening and reached in to grab Shane's shoulder. When he touched him, Shane was wild-eyed and rapidly crawled toward the line with such speed that he wedged the two men in the passage. Mike was facing the pocket, and Shane swam below him to grab the line. This caused the men to be stacked head to toe in a tight passage over 180 feet below the surface. Shane was thrashing and kicking, trying to escape this new trap, while Mike was protecting his face from the heels that were sharply kicking him in the head. The unreal nature of this situation was hard to comprehend. The two men were on their own, and someone had to figure out how to free them before something catastrophic happened. Mike was able to find a spot overhead to push his legs and give Shane the space to squeeze his hips past the protruding rocks. As soon as Shane cleared, Mike fell straight down into the hole that was beneath them. He was literally stunned. It took a few moments to gather himself. He realized that he was okay, and his equipment was mostly still intact. A valve on his suit had been ripped, so 52-degree water was now leaking inside, making hypothermia a heightened risk. He also lost a fin and had to search around to locate it. He then took a few breaths and decided immediately that he wouldn't make a single move without a clear purpose towards getting out of this maze of rocks. He was again without the guideline, which can mean certain death in a completely silted-out cave. He methodically moved up, locating reasonable holes to move through, and in just a few moves, he was lucky for the second time to find the guideline in the hole above. He grabbed the line and followed it through the next restriction. He hadn't seen Shane for a while now, but assumed that he was ahead of him. Mike could feel the movement on the line, so he knew that Shane was also moving towards the exit up higher on the guide. As Mike reached the next tie off of the line, the movement stopped. He was immediately worried, because that meant that Shane was actually behind him, still holding on to the previous stretch of the guideline. Mike turned around and headed back down. He was worried about Shane. His panic earlier had been life-threatening, for both of them. Mike had to squeeze himself through an uncomfortable restriction and follow along the guide back down into the maze of boulders. Suddenly, the line went still. Mike could no longer feel any movement. This could only mean one thing. Shane was in trouble. Mike moved along until he came to a shocking sight. Shane was stuck in a tight restriction, and he wasn't moving. He no longer had his rebreather regulator in his mouth, and his bailout bottle was deployed. His wetsuit was ripped open in several places, and the cord to his diving computer was ripped off. Shane had clearly struggled with everything he had to free himself, but sadly, Shane was dead. Mike checked Shane and tried to remove his equipment to free him, but it became clear that he would have to get back up to start decompression stops and let everyone know what had happened. It took hours of decompression and warming up for Mike to safely explain everything that had happened. Because he was the only diver on site who had been past the 140-foot restriction, he would be the one to recover Shane's body the next day. The GoPro footage showed everything that Mike had described, as well as what had happened to Shane just before his death. After the men had become unstuck, Shane had overwhelmed his rebreather system and switched to his bailout bottle of air. This was a traditional scuba tank, with a limited air supply. After getting stuck, Shane had exhausted his air supply, and sadly, he suffocated before being discovered. Despite having decades of experience, he still fell victim to panic. The series of close calls leading up to this final moment had put Shane in a frantic frame of mind which, sadly, failed him in the final emergency he faced.